Everyone loves to listen to a good book, and there are so many wonderful ones to choose, so we decided to bring you this podcast of Stories Come to Life. Each episode features a story from either classic or modern literature, especially chosen to be interesting and exciting to hear. So sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. Welcome to Stories Come to Life. I am your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Not only are Shirley, Carol, and George Hollister charmed by the big old barn, but Sidney and Elizabeth Graham can see the possibilities too. The elegant Graham siblings are also charmed by the humble and steadfast Hollisters too, and they are determined to make the barn as welcoming and comfortable as possible, while trying at the same time to respect Shirley and her family's pride and their determination not to take advantage of their new landlord. What fun it is to find ways to stealthily improve the place. It is an exciting time for everyone. Now sit back, relax, and listen to this story come to life. The Enchanted Barn by Grace Livingston Hill. Chapter 7. Carol and Elizabeth got on very well together. Shirley was amazed to see the ease with which her sister entered into this new relation, unawed by the garments of her hostess. Carol had more of the modern young America in her than Shirley, perhaps, whose early life had been more conventionally guarded. Carol was democratic and, strange to say, felt slightly superior to Elizabeth, on account of going to a public school. The high school girls were in the habit of referring to a neighborhood boarding school as Dummy's Retreat, and therefore Carol was not at all awed by the other girl, who declared in a friendly manner that she had always been crazy to go to the public school, and asked rapid, intelligent questions about the doings there. Before they were out of the city limits, the two girls were talking a steady stream, and one could see from their eyes that they liked each other. Shirley, relieved, settled back on the comfortable cushions and let herself rest and relax. She tried to think how it would feel to own a car like this and be able to ride around when she wanted to. On the front seat, George and Graham were already excellent friends, and George was gaining valuable information about running a car, which he had ample opportunity to put into practice as soon as they got outside the crowded thoroughfares. They were perhaps halfway to the old barn, and running smoothly on an open road, with no one in sight a long way ahead, when Graham turned back to Shirley, leaving George to run the car for a moment himself. The boy's heart swelled with gratitude and utmost devotion to be thus trusted. Of course, there wasn't anything to do but keep things just as he had been told, but this man realized that he would do it and not perform any crazy, daring action to show off. George set himself to be worthy of this trust. To be sure, young Graham had a watchful eye upon things and was taking no chances, but he let the boy feel free and did not make him aware of his espionage, which is a course of action that will win any boy to give the best that is in him to any responsibility, if he has any best at all. It was not the kind of conversation that one would expect between landlord and tenant that the young girl and the man carried on in these brief sentences now and then. He called her attention to the soft green tint that was spreading over the treetops more distinctly than the day before, to the lazy little clouds floating over the blue, to the tinting of the fields, now taking on every hour new colors, to the perfume in the air. So, with pleasantness of passage, they arrived at last at the old barn. Like a pack of eager children, they tumbled out of the car and hurried up to the barn, all talking at once, forgetting all difference in station. They were just young and out on a picnic. Graham had brought a key for the big padlock, and clumsily the man and the boy, unused to such maneuvers, unlocked and shoved back the two great doors. "These doors are too heavy. They should have ball bearings," remarked young Graham. "I'll attend to that at once. They should be made to move with a light touch. I declare it doesn't pay to let property lie idle without a tenant. There are so many little things that get neglected." He walked around with a wise air, as if he had been an active landowner for years, though indeed he was looking at everything with strange, ignorant eyes. His standard was a home where every detail was perfect, and where necessities came and vanished with the need. This was his first view into the possibilities of being up against it, as he phrased it in his mind. Elizabeth, in her blue velvet cloak and blue cloudy veil, stood like a sweet fairy in the wide doorway, and looked around with delight. "Oh, Sid, wouldn't this just be a dandy place for a party?" she exclaimed eagerly. "You could put the orchestra over in that corner behind a screen of palms, and decorate with gray Florida moss and asparagus vine with daffodils wired on in showers from the beams, and palms all around the walls, and colored electrics hidden everywhere. You could run a wire in from the street, couldn't you, the way they did at Uncle Andy's, and serve the supper out on the lawn, with little individual rustic tables. Brower has them, and he brings them out with chairs to match. You could have the tree wired, too, and have colored electrics all over the place. Oh, wouldn't it be just heavenly? Say, Sid, Carol says they're coming out to live here, maybe. Why couldn't we give them a party like that for a housewarming?" Sidney Graham looked at his eager, impractical young sister, and then at the faces of the three Hollisters, and tried not to laugh, as the tremendous contrast of circumstances was presented to him. But his rare tact served him in good stead. "Why, Elizabeth, that would doubtless be very delightful. But Miss Hollister tells me her mother has been quite ill, and I'm sure, while that might be the happiest thing imaginable for you young folks, it would be rather trying on an invalid. I guess you'll have to have your party somewhere else for the present." "Oh," said Elizabeth with quick recollection. "Of course, they told me about their mother. How thoughtless of me. But it would be lovely, wouldn't it, Miss Hollister? Can't you see it?" She turned in wistful appeal to Shirley, and that young woman, being a dreamer herself, at once responded with a radiant smile. "Indeed I can, and it would be lovely indeed. But I've been thinking what a lovely home it could be made, too." "Yes?" said Elizabeth questioningly, and looking around with a dubious frown. "It would need a lot of changing, I should think. You would want hardwood floors and lots of rugs and some partitions and windows." "Oh, no," said Shirley, laughing. "We're not hardwood people, dear. We're just plain hard-working people. And all we need is a quiet, sweet place to rest in. It's going to be heavenly here, with that tree outside to shade the doorway, and all this wide space to walk around in. We live in a little narrow city house now, and never have any place to get out except the street. We'll have the birds and the brook for orchestra, and we won't need palms, because the trees and vines will soon be in leaf, and make a lovely screen for our orchestra. I imagine at night the stars will have almost as many colors as electrics." Elizabeth looked at her with puzzled eyes, but she was half convinced. "Well, yes, perhaps they would," she said, and smiled. "I've never thought of them that way, but it does sound very pretty, quite like some of Browning's poetry that I don't understand. Or was it Mrs. Browning? I can't quite remember." Sidney Graham, investigating the loft above them, stood a moment, watching the tableau and listening to the conversation, though they could not see him, and he thought within himself that it might not be a bad thing for his little sister, with her boarding-school rearing, to get near to these true-hearted young working people, who yet were dreamers and poets, and get her standards somewhat modified by theirs. He was especially delighted with the gentle, womanly way in which Shirley answered the girl now, when she thought herself alone with her. George and Carol had grasped hold of hands and run wildly down the slope to the brook, after a most casual glance at the interior of the barn. Elizabeth now turned her dainty high-heeled boots in the brook's direction, and Shirley was left alone to walk the length and breadth of her new abode, and make some real plans. The young man in the dim loft above watched her for a moment as she stood looking from one wall to the other, measuring distances with her eye, walking quickly over to the window and rubbing a clear space on the dusty pane with her handkerchief that she might look out. She was a goodly sight, and he could not help comparing her with the girls he knew, though their garments would have far outshone hers. Still, even in the shabby dark blue serge, she seemed lovely. The young people returned, and both Carol and George of their own accord joined Shirley in a brief council of war. Graham thoughtfully called his sister away, ostensibly to watch a squirrel high in a big tree, but really to admonish her about making no further propositions like that for the party, as the young people to whom he had introduced her were not well off, and had no money or time for elaborate entertainments. "But they're lovely, Sid, aren't they? Don't you like them just awfully? I know you do, or you wouldn't have taken the trouble to bring them out here in the car with us. Say, you'll bring me out to see them often after they come to live here, won't you?" "Perhaps," said her brother smilingly. "But hadn't you better wait until they ask you?" "Oh, they'll ask me," said Elizabeth with a charming smile and a confident little toss of her head. "I'll make them ask me." "Be careful, kid," he said, still smiling. "Remember, they won't have much money to offer you entertainment with, and probably their things are very plain and simple. You may embarrass them if you invite yourself out." Elizabeth raised her azure eyes to her brother's face thoughtfully for a moment, then smiled back confidently once more. "Don't you worry, Sid dear. There's more than one way. I won't hurt their feelings, but they're going to ask me, and they're going to want me, and I'm going to come. Yes, and you're going to bring me." She turned with a laughing pirouette and danced down the length of the barn to Carol, catching her hand and whirling her after her in a regular childish frolic. "Well, do you think we ought to take it? Do you think I dare give my final word without consulting Mother?" Shirley asked her brother when they were thus left alone for a minute. "Sure thing. No mistake. It's simply great. You couldn't get a place like this if you went the whole length and breadth of the city and had a whole lot more money than you have to spend." "But remember, it's a barn," said Shirley impressively. "Mother may mind that very much." "Not when she sees it," said Carol, whirling back to the consultation. "She'll think it's the sensiblest thing we ever did. She isn't foolish like that. We'll tell her we've found a place to camp, with a shanty attached, and she can't be disappointed. I think it'll be great. Just think how Doris can run in the grass." "Yes," put in George. "I was telling Carol down by the spring before that girl came and stopped us. I think we might have some chickens and raise eggs. Harley could do that, and Carol and I could raise flowers, and I could take 'em to town in the morning. I could work evenings." Shirley smiled. She almost felt like shouting that they had agreed with her. The place seemed so beautiful, so almost heavenly to her when she thought of the close, dark quarters at home, and the summer with its heat coming on. "We couldn't keep a lodger, and we'd have that much less," said Shirley thoughtfully. "But we wouldn't have their laundry, nor their room work to do," said Carol, "and I could have that much more time for the garden and chickens." "You mustn't count on being able to make much that way," said Shirley gravely. "You know nothing about gardening, and would probably make a lot of mistakes at first anyway." "I can make fudge and sandwiches and take them to school to sell," declared Carol stoutly. "And I'll find out how to raise flowers and parsley and little things people have to have. Besides, there's watercress down by that brook, and people like that. We could sell that." "Well, we'll see," said Shirley thoughtfully. "But you mustn't get up too many ideas yet. If we can only get moved and Mother satisfied, I guess we can get along. The rent is only $10. "Good night! That's cheap enough," said George, and drew a long whistle. Then, seeing Elizabeth approach, he put on an indifferent air and sauntered to the dusty window at the other end of the barn. Sidney Graham appeared now, and took Shirley over to the east end, to ask her just where she thought would be a good place to put the partition, and did she think it would be a good thing to have another one at the other end just like it? And so they stood and planned, quite as if Shirley were ordering a $10,000 alteration put into her $10 barn. Then suddenly the girl remembered her fears, and, looking straight up into the interested face of the young man, she asked earnestly, "Are you sure you were going to put in those partitions? You're not making any change on my account, because I couldn't think of allowing you to go to any trouble or expense, you know." Her straightforward look embarrassed him. "Why, he said, growing a little flushed. "Why, you see, I hadn't been out to look at these things before. I didn't realize how much better it would be to have those in, you know. But now I intend to do it right away. Father put the whole thing in my hands to do as I pleased. In fact, the place is mine now, and I want to put it in good shape to rent. So don't worry yourself in the least. Things won't go to rack and ruin so quickly, you know, if there's someone on the place." He finished his sentence briskly. It seemed quite plausible even to himself now, and he searched about for a change of topic. "You think you can get on here with the rough floor? You might put padding or something under your carpets, you know, but it'll take pretty large carpets." He looked at her dubiously. To his conventional mind, every step of the way was blocked by some impassable barrier. He did not honestly see how she was going to do the thing at all. "Oh, we don't need carpets," laughed Shirley gaily. "We'll spread down a rug in front of Mother's bed, and another one by the piano, and the rest will be just perfectly all right. We're not expecting to give receptions here, you know," she added mischievously. "We're only campers, and very grateful campers at that, too, to find a nice, clean, empty floor where we can live. The only thing that's troubling me is the cooking. I've been wondering if it will affect the insurance if we use an oil stove to cook with. Or would you rather we got a wood stove and put a pipe out of one of the windows? I've seen people do that sometimes. Of course, we could cook outdoors on a campfire if it was necessary, but it might be a little inconvenient on rainy days." Graham gasped at the coolness with which this little slip of a girl discoursed about hardships, as if they were necessities to be accepted pleasantly and without a murmur. She actually would not be daunted at the idea of cooking her meals on a fire out of doors. Cooking, indeed! That was, of course, a question that people had to consider. It had never been a question that crossed his mind before. People cooked. How did they cook? By electricity, gas, coal, and wood fires, of course. He had never considered it a matter to be called in any way serious. But now he perceived that it was one of the first main things to be looked out for in a home. He looked down at the waiting girl with a curious mixture of wonder, admiration, and dismay in his face. "Why, of course you will need a fire and a kitchen," he said, as if these things usually grew in houses without any help, and it hadn't occurred to him before that they were not indigenous to barns. "Well, now, I hadn't thought of that. There isn't any chimney here, is there? There ought to be a chimney in every barn. It would be better for the hay, I should think. Keep it dry, you know, and all that sort of thing. And then I should think it might be better for the animals. I must look into that matter." "No, Mr. Graham," said Shirley decidedly. "There is no necessity for a chimney. We can perfectly well have the pipe go through a piece of tin set in the back window if you won't object, and we can use the little oil stove when it's very hot, if that doesn't affect the insurance. We have a gas stove, of course, that we could bring, but there isn't any gas in a barn." Graham looked around blankly at the cobwebby walls, as if expecting gas jets to break forth simultaneously with his wish. "No, I suppose not," he said, "although I should think there ought to be, in a barn, you know. But I'm sure there will be no objection whatever to your using any kind of a stove that will work here. This is a stone barn, you know, and I'm sure it won't affect the insurance. I'll find out and let you know." Shirley felt a trifle uneasy yet about those partitions and the low price of the rent, but somehow the young man had managed to impress her with the fact that he was under no unpleasant delusions concerning herself, and that he had the utmost respect for her. He stood looking down earnestly at her for a moment, without saying a word, and then he began hesitatingly. "I wish you'd let me tell you," he said frankly, "how awfully brave you are about all this, planning to come out here in this lonely place, and not being afraid of hard work and rough floors and a barn, and even a fire out of doors." Shirley's laugh rang out, and her eyes sparkled. "Why, it's the nicest thing that's happened to me in ages," she said joyously. "I can't hardly believe it's true that we can come here, and we can really afford to come to a great, heavenly country place like this. I suppose, of course, there'll be hard things. There always are, and some of them have been just about unbearable. But even the hard things can be made fun if you try. This is going to be grand." And she looked around triumphantly on the dusty rafters and the rough stone walls with a little air of possession. "You are rather—" he paused. "Unusual," he finished thoughtfully, as they walked toward the doorway and stood looking off at the distance. But now Shirley had almost forgotten him in the excitement of the view. "Just think of waking up to that every morning," she declared, with a sweep of her little blue-clad arm toward the view in the distance. "Those purply hills, the fringe of brown and green against the horizon, that white spire nestling among those evergreens. Is that a church? Is it near enough for us to go to? Mother wouldn't want us to be too far from church." "We'll go home that way and discover," said Graham decidedly. "You'll want to get acquainted with your new neighborhood. You'll need to know how near there is a store and where your neighbors live. We'll reconnoiter a little. Are you ready to go?" "Oh, yes. I'm afraid we've kept you too long already, and we must get home about the time Carol usually comes home from school, or Mother will be terribly worried. Carol is never later than 4:30. "We've plenty of time," the driver of the car said, looking at his watch and smiling assurance. "Call the children, and we'll take a little turn around the neighborhood before we go back." And so the little eager company were reluctantly persuaded to climb into the car again and start on their way. Chapter 8. The car leaped forward up the smooth white road, and the great barn, as they looked back to it, seemed to smile pleasantly to them in farewell. Shirley looked back and tried to think how it would seem to come home every night and see Doris standing at the top of the grassy incline, waiting to welcome her. Tried to fancy her mother in a hammock under the big tree a little later, when it grew warm and summery, and the boys working in their garden. It seemed too heavenly to be true. The car swept around the corner of Allister Avenue and curved down between tall trees. The white spire in the distance drew nearer now, and the purplish hills were off at one side. The way was fresh with smells of spring, and everywhere were sweet scents and droning bees and croaking frogs. The spirit of the day seemed to enter into the young people and make them glad. Somehow, all at once, they seemed to have known one another a long time, and to be intimately acquainted with one another's tastes and ecstasies. They exclaimed together over the distant view of the misty city, with the river winding on its far way, and shouted simultaneously over a frightened rabbit that scurried across the road and hid in the brushwood. And then the car wound round a curve, and the little white church swept into view below them. "The little white church in the valley is bright with the blossoms of May, and true as the heart of your lover, who waits for your coming today," chanted forth George in a favorite selection of the department store Victrola, and all the rest looked interested. It was a pretty church, and nestled under the hills as if it were part of the landscape, making a home center for the town. "We can go to church and Sunday school there," said Shirley eagerly. "How nice! That will please Mother." Elizabeth looked at her curiously. and then speculatively toward the church. "It looks awfully small and cheap," said Elizabeth. "All the more chance for us to help," said Shirley. "It will be good for us." "What could you do to help a church?" asked the wondering Elizabeth. "Give money to paint it? The paint is all scaling off." "We couldn't give much money," said Carol, "because we haven't got it. But there's lots of things to do in a church besides giving. You teach in Sunday school and you wait on tables at suppers when they have ladies' aid." "Maybe they'll ask you to play the organ, Shirley," suggested George. "Oh, George," reproved Shirley, "they'll have plenty that can play better than I can. Remember, I haven't had time to practice for ages." "She's a crackerjack at the piano," confided George to Graham in a low growl. "She hasn't had a lesson since Father died. But before that she used to be at it all the time. She can sing, too. You ought to hear her." "I'm sure I should like to," assented Graham heartily. "I wonder if you'll help me to get her to sing sometime if I come out to call after you're settled." "Sure," said George heartily. "But she maybe won't do it. She's awfully nutty about singing sometimes. She's not stuck on herself for nothing." But the little white church was left far behind, and the city swept on apace. They were nearing home now, and Graham insisted on knowing where they lived, that he might put them down at their door. Shirley would have pleaded an errand and had them set down in the business part of the town, but George airily gave the street and number, and Shirley could not prevail upon Graham to stop at his office and let them go their way. And so the last few minutes of the drive were silent for Shirley, and her cheeks grew rosy with humiliation over the dark, little narrow street where they would presently arrive. Perhaps when he saw this, the cultured young man would think they were too poor and common to be good tenants even for a barn. But when they stopped before the little 2-story brick house, you would not have known from the expression on the young man's face as he glanced at the number, but that the house was a marble front on the most exclusive avenue in the city. He handed down Shirley with all the grace that he would have used to wait upon a millionaire's daughter, and she liked the way he helped out Carol and spoke to George as if he were an old chum. "I want you to come and see me next Saturday," called Elizabeth to Carol as the car glided away from the curb. "And I'm coming out to help you get settled, remember?" The brother and the 2 sisters stood in front of their little old dark house and watched the elegant car glide away. They were filled with wonder at themselves that they had been all the afternoon a part of that elegant outfit. Was it a dream? They rubbed their eyes as the car disappeared around the corner and turned to look up at the familiar windows and make sure where they were. Then they stood a moment to decide how they should explain to the waiting mother why they happened to be home so early. It was finally decided that George should go out to hunt up a drayman and find out what he would charge to move their things to the country, and Shirley should go to a neighbor's to inquire about a stove she heard they wanted to sell. Then Carol could go in alone, and there would be nothing to explain. There was no telling when either George or Shirley would have a holiday again, and it was as well to get these things arranged as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Graham was eagerly interviewing her brother, having taken the vacant front seat for the purpose. "Sid, where did you find those perfectly dear people? I think they're just great. And are they really going to live in that barn? Won't that be dandy? I wish Mother'd let me go out and spend a month with them. I mean to ask her. That Carol is the nicest girl ever. She's just a dear." "Now look here, kid," said Graham, facing about to his sister. "I want you to understand a thing or two. I took you on this expedition because I thought I could trust you, see?" Elizabeth nodded. "Well, I don't want a lot of talk at home about this. Do you understand? I want you to wait a bit and go slow. If things seem to be all right a little later on, you can ask Carol to come and see you perhaps, but you'll have to look out. She hasn't the fine clothes to go visiting in, I imagine, and they're pretty proud. I guess they've lost their money. Their father died a couple of years ago, and they've been up against it. They do seem like awfully nice people, I'll admit, and if it's all right later on, You can get to be friends. But you'll have to go slow. Mother wouldn't understand it, and she mustn't be annoyed, you know. I'll take you out to see them sometime when they get settled if it seems all right. But meantime, can you keep your tongue still?" Elizabeth's face fell, but she gave her word immediately. She and her brother were chums. It was easy to see that. "But can't I have her out for a weekend, Sid? Can't I tell Mother anything about her? I could lend her some dresses, you know." "You go slow, kid, and leave the matter to me. I'll tell Mother about them pretty soon, when I've had the chance to see a little more of them, and I'm sure Mother wouldn't mind. Meanwhile, don't you fret. I'll take you out when I go on business, and you'll see her pretty soon again." Elizabeth had to be content with that. She perceived that for some reason her brother did not care to have the matter talked over in the family. She knew that they would all tease him about his interest in a girl who wanted to rent his barn, and she felt that Shirley was too fine to be talked about in that way. The family wouldn't understand unless they saw her. "I know what you mean, Sid," she said after a thoughtful pause. "You want the folks to see them before they judge what they are, don't you?" "That's just exactly the point," said Sidney, with a gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. "That's just what makes you such a good pal, kid. You always understand." The smile dawned again in Elizabeth's eyes, and she patted her brother's sleeve. "Good old Sid," she murmured tenderly. "You're all right. And I just know you're going to take me out to that barn soon. Aren't you going to fix it up for them a little? They can't live there that way. It would be a dandy place to live if the windows were bigger, and there were doors like a house, and a piazza and some fireplaces. A great big stone fireplace in the middle there opposite that door. Wouldn't that be sweet? And they'll have to have electric lights and some bathrooms, of course." Her brother tipped back his head and laughed. "I'm afraid you wouldn't make much of a hand to live in a barn, kid," he said. "You're too much of an aristocrat. How much do you want for your money? My dear, they don't expect tiled bathrooms and electric lights and inlaid floors when they rent a barn for the summer." "But aren't you going to do anything, Sid?" "Well, I can't do much, for Miss Hollister would suspect right away. She's very businesslike, and she has suspicions already because I said I was going to put in partitions. She isn't an object of charity, you know. I imagine they're all pretty proud." Elizabeth sat thoughtful and still. It was the first time in her life she had contemplated what it would be like to be very poor. Her brother watched her with interest. He had a feeling that it was going to be very good for Elizabeth to know these Hollisters. Suddenly he brought the car to a stop before the office of a big lumber yard they were passing. "I'm going in here, kid, for just a minute, to see if I can get a man to put in those partitions." Elizabeth sat meditatively studying the office window, through whose large dusty panes could be seen tall strips of molding, unpainted window frames, and a fluted column or two, evidently ready to fill an order. The sign over the door set forth that window sashes, doors, and blinds were to be had. Suddenly, Elizabeth sat straight up and read the sign again, strained her eyes to see through the window, and then opened the car door and sprang out. In a moment more, she stood beside her brother, pointing mutely to a large window frame that stood against the wall. "What is it, kid?" he asked kindly. "Sid, why can't you put in great big windows like that? They would never notice the windows, you know. It would be so nice to have plenty of light and air." "That's so," he murmured. "I might change the windows some without its being noticed." Then to the man at the desk, "What's the price of that window? Got any more?" "Yes," said the man, looking up interested. "Got half a dozen, made especially for a party." And then he wasn't pleased. "Claimed he ordered sash windows instead of casement. If you can use those 6, we'll make you a special price." "Oh, take them, Sid. They're perfectly lovely," said Elizabeth eagerly. "They're casement windows with diamond panes. They'll be just so quaint and artistic in that stone." "Well, I don't know how they'll fit," said the young man doubtfully. "I don't want to make it seem as if I was trying to put on too much style. No, Sid, it won't seem that way, really. I tell you, they'll never notice the windows are bigger. And casement windows aren't like a regular house, you know. See, they'll open wide like doors. I think it would be just grand." "All right, kid, we'll see. We'll take the man out with us, and if he says it can be done, I'll take him." Elizabeth was overjoyed. "That's just what it needed," she declared. "They couldn't live in the dark on rainy days. You must put 2 in the front, on each side the door, and 1 on each end. The back windows will do well enough." "Well, come on, kid. Mr. Jones is going out with me at once. Do you want to go with us, or shall I call a taxi and send you home?" asked her brother. "I'm going with you, of course," said Elizabeth eagerly, hurrying out to the car, as if she thought the thing would be done all wrong without her. So Elizabeth sat in the back seat alone, while her brother and the contractor discoursed on the price of lumber and the relative values of wood and stone for building purposes. And the big car went back over the way it had been before that afternoon. They stopped on the way out and picked up one of Mr. Jones's carpenters, who was just leaving a job with his kit of tools, and who climbed stolidly into the back seat and sat as far away from the little blue velvet miss as possible, all the while taking furtive notes to tell his own little girl about her when he went home. Elizabeth climbed out and went about the barn with them, listening to all they had to say. The 2 men took out pencils and foot rules and went about measuring and figuring. Elizabeth watched them with bright, attentive eyes, putting a whispered suggestion now and then to her brother. "They can't go up and down a ladder all the time," she whispered. "There ought to be some rough stairs with a railing, at least as good as our back stairs at home." "What about it?" said Graham aloud to the contractor. "Can you put in some steps, just rough ones to the left? I'm going to have a party out here camping for a while this summer, and I want it to be safe. Need a railing, you know, so nobody'll get a fall." The man measured the space up with his eye. "Just want plain steps framed up with a handrail," he said, squinting up again. "Guess we'd better start 'em up this way to the back wall and then turn back from a landing. That'll suit the overhead space best. Just pine you want 'em, I suppose?" Elizabeth stood like a blue bird alighted on the doorsill, watching and listening. She was a regular woman and saw big possibilities in the building. She would have enjoyed ordering parquet flooring and carved newel posts and making a regular palace. The sun was setting behind the purply hill and sending a glint from the weather vane on the little white church spire when they started back to the city. Elizabeth looked wistfully toward it and wondered about the rapt expression on Shirley's face when she spoke of working in the church. How could anyone get any pleasure out of that? She meant to find out. At present, her life was rather monotonous, and she longed to have some new interests. That night, after she had gone to her luxurious little couch, she lay down in her downy nest and tried to think how it would be to live in that big barn and go to sleep up in the loft, lying on that hay. Then suddenly the mystery of life was upon her with its big problems. Why, for instance, was she born into the Graham family, with money and culture and all the good times, and that sweet, bright Carol girl, born into the Hollister family, where they had a hard time to live at all? Chapter 9. Quite early the next morning, Sidney Graham was in his office at the telephone. He conferred with the carpenter, agreeing to meet him out at the barn and make final arrangements about the windows in a very short time. Then he called up the trolley company and the electric company and made arrangements with them to have a wire run from the road to his barn, with a very satisfactory agreement whereby he could pay them a certain sum for the use of as much light as he needed. This done, he called up an electrician and arranged that he should send some men out that morning to wire the barn. He hurried through his morning mail, giving his stenographer a free hand with answering some of the letters, and then speeded out to Glenside. 3 men were already there, 2 of them stonemasons, working away under the direction of the contractor. They had already begun working at the massive stone around the windows, striking musical blows from a light scaffolding that made the old barn look as if it had suddenly waked up and gone to house cleaning. Sidney Graham surveyed it with satisfaction as he stopped his car by the roadside and got out. He did delight to have things done on time. He decided that if this contractor did well on the job, he would see that he got bigger things to do. He liked it that his work had begun at once. The next car brought a quartet of carpenters, and before young Graham went back to the city, a motor truck had arrived, loaded with lumber and window frames. It was all very fascinating to him, this new toy barn that had suddenly come into his possession, and he could hardly tear himself away from it and go back to business. One would not have supposed, perhaps, that it was so very necessary for him to do so either, seeing that he was already so well off that he could really have gotten along quite comfortably for the rest of his life without any more money. But he was a conscientious young man who believed that no living being had a right to exist in idleness, and who had gone into business from a desire to do his best and keep up the honorable name of his father's firm. So after he had given careful directions for the electric men when they should come, he rushed back to his office once more. The next 2 days were filled with delightful novelties. He spent much time flying from office to barn and back to the office again, and before evening of the second day, he had decided that a telephone in the barn was an absolute necessity, at least while the work was going on. So he called up the telephone company and arranged that connection should be put in at once. That evening he wrote a short note to Miss Shirley Hollister, telling her that the partitions were underway and would soon be completed, and that in a few days he would send her the key so that she might begin to transport her belongings to the new home. The next morning, when Graham went out to the stone barn, he found that the front windows were in, and gave a very inviting appearance to the edifice, both outside and in. As Elizabeth had surmised, the big latticed windows opening inwards like casement doors seemed quite in keeping with the rough stone structure. Graham began to wonder why all barns did not affect this style of window. They were so entirely attractive. He was thoroughly convinced that the new tenants would not be likely to remember or notice the difference in the windows. He was sure he wouldn't have, unless his attention had been called to them in some way. Of course, the sills and sashes were rather new-looking, but he gave orders that they should at once be painted an unobtrusive dark green, which would well accord with the mossy roof, and he trusted his particular young tenant would not think that he had done anything pointed in changing the windows. If she did, he would have to think up some excuse. But as he stood at the top of the grassy slope and looked about, he noticed the great pile of stones under each window, from the masonry that had been torn away to make room for the larger sashes. An idea came to him. "Mr. Jones," he called to the contractor, who had just come over on the trolley car to see how the work was progressing. "Wouldn't there be stones enough altogether from all the windows to build some kind of a rude chimney and fireplace?" he asked. Mr. Jones thought there would. There were stones enough down in the meadow to piece out with, in case they needed more anyway. Where would Mr. Graham want the fireplace? Directly opposite the front doors? He had thought of suggesting that himself, but didn't know as Mr. Graham wanted to go to any more expense. "By all means, make that fireplace," said the young owner delightedly. "This is going to be a jolly place when it gets done, isn't it? I declare I don't know but I'd like to come out here and live." "It would make a fine old house, sir," said the contractor respectfully, looking up almost reverently at the barn. "I'd like to see it with verandas and more winders and a few such things. You don't see many of these old stone buildings around here now. They knew how to build 'em substantial in those old times, so they did." "Ah, yes, it would make a fine site for a house, wouldn't it?" said the young man, looking about thoughtfully. "Well, now, we'll have to think about that sometime, perhaps. However, I think it looks very nice for the present." And he walked about, looking at the improvements with great satisfaction. At each end of the barn, A good room, long and narrow, had been partitioned off, each of which, by use of a curtain, would make 2 very large rooms. And yet, the main section of the floor looked as large as ever. A simple stairway of plain boards had been constructed a little to one side of the middle toward the back, going up to the loft, which had been made safe for the children by a plain rude railing, consisting of a few uprights with strips across. The darkening slats at the small windows in the loft had been torn away, and shutters substituted that would open wide and let in air and light. Rough spots in the floor had been mended, and around the great place, both upstairs and down, and even down in the basement underneath, electric wires ran with simple lights and switches, conveniently arranged, so that if it became desirable, the whole place could be made a blaze of light. The young man did not like to think of this family of unprotected women and children coming out into the country without all the arrangements possible to make them feel safe. For this reason also he had established the telephone. He had talked it over with the agent, paying a certain sum for its installation, and had a telephone put in that they could pay for whenever they desired to use it. This would make the young householder feel more comfortable about leaving her mother out in the country all day, and also prevent her pride from being hurt. The telephone was there. She need not use it unless necessity arose. He felt he could explain that to her. If she didn't like it, of course, she could have it taken away. There were a lot more things he would like to do to make the place more habitable, but he did not dare. Sometimes even now his conscience troubled him. What did he know about these people anyway? And what kind of a flighty youth was he becoming, that he let a strange girl's appealing face drive him to such lengths as he was going now? Telephone and electric lights and stairs and a fireplace in a barn? It was all perfectly preposterous, and if his family should hear of it, he would never hear the last of it. That he was certain. At such times he would hunt up his young sister and carry her off for a long drive in the car, always ending up at Glenside Road, where she exclaimed and praised to his heart's content, and gave anew her word not to tell anybody a thing about it until he was ready. Indeed, Elizabeth was wild with delight. She wanted to hunt up some of her mother's old Turkish rugs that were put away in dark closets, to decorate the walls with pictures and bric-a-brac from her own room, and to smother the place in flowering shrubs for the arrival of the tenants. But her brother firmly forbade anything more being done. He waited with fear and trembling for the time when the clear-eyed young tenant should look upon the changes he had already made, for something told him she would not stand charity, and there was a point beyond which he must not go if he wished ever to see her again. At last, one morning, he ventured to call her up on the telephone at her office. "My sister and I were thinking of going out to see how things are progressing at the Glenside place," he said after he had explained who he was. "I was wondering if you would care to come along and look things over. What time do you get through at your office this afternoon?" "That's very kind of you, Mr. Graham," said Shirley, "but I'm afraid that won't be possible. I'm not usually done until 5:30. I might get through by 5, but not much sooner, and that would be too late for you." "Not at all, Miss Hollister. That would be a very agreeable time. I have matters that will keep me here quite late tonight, and that will be just right for me. Shall I call for you then at 5, or is that too soon?" "Oh, no, I can be ready by then, I'm sure," said Shirley, with suppressed excitement. "You're very kind." "Not at all. It will be a pleasure," came the answer. "Then I will call at your office at 5. And the receiver clicked at the other end, leaving Shirley in a whirl of doubt and joy. How perfectly delightful! And yet, ought she to go? Would Mother think it was all right? His little sister was going, but was it quite right for her to accept this much attention, even in a business way? It wasn't at all customary or necessary, and both he and she knew it. He was just doing it to be nice. And then there was Mother. She must send a message somehow, or Mother would be frightened when she did not come home at her usual time. She finally succeeded in getting Carol at her school and told her to tell Mother she was kept late and might not be home till after 7. Then she flew at her work to get it out of the way before 5 o'clock. But when she came down at the appointed time, she found Carol sitting excitedly in the back seat with Elizabeth, fairly bursting with the double pleasure of the ride and of surprising her sister. They came to the school for me and took me home, and I explained to Mother that I was going with you to look at a place we were going to move to. I put on the potatoes and put the meat in the oven, and Mother is going to tell George just what to do to finish supper when he gets home," she exclaimed eagerly. "And oh, isn't it lovely?" "Indeed it is lovely," said Shirley, her face flushing with pleasure, and her eyes speaking gratitude to the young man in the front seat, who was opening the door for her to step in beside him. That was a wonderful ride. The spring had made tremendous advances in her work during the 10 days since they went that way before. The flush of green the willows had worn had become a soft, bright feather of foliage, and the maples had set out crimson tassels to offset them. Down in the meadows and along the roadside, the grass was thick and green, and the bare brown fields had disappeared. Little brooks sang tinklingly as they glided under bridges, and the birds darted here and there in busy, noisy pairs. Frail, wavering blossoms starred the swampy places, and the air was sweet with scents of living things. But when they came in sight of the barn, Elizabeth and her brother grew silent from sheer desire to talk, and not act as if there was anything different about it. Now that they had actually brought Shirley here, the new windows seemed fairly to flaunt themselves in their shining mossy paint and their vast extent of diamond panes, so that the two conspirators were deeply embarrassed and dared not face what they had done. It was Carol who broke the silence that had come upon them all. "Oh, oh, oh," she shouted. "Shirley, just look. New great big windows. Isn't that great? Now you needn't worry about whether it will be too dark from other days when she can't go out. Isn't this the best ever?" But Shirley looked, and her cheeks grew pink as her eyes grew starry. She opened her lips to speak and then closed them again, for the words would not come, and the tears came instead. But she drove them back and then managed to say, "Oh, Mr. Graham, oh, you have gone to so much trouble." No trouble at all," he said almost crossly, for he had wanted her not to notice those windows, at least not yet. "You see, it was this way. The windows were some that were left over from another order, and I got a chance to get 'em at a bargain price. I thought they might as well be put in now as at any time, and you get the benefit of them. The barn really needed more light. It was a very dark barn indeed, hadn't you noticed it? I can't see how my grandfather thought it would do to have so little light and air. But you know in old times they didn't have such advanced ideas about ventilation and germs and things." He felt he was getting on rather famously, until he looked down at the clear eyes of the girl, and knew she was seeing right straight through all his talk. However, she hadn't the face to tell him so, and so he boldly held on his way, making up fine stories about things the barns needed, until he all but believed them himself. And when he got through, he needed only to finish with, "And if it isn't so, it ought to be." He managed to talk on in this vein until he could stop the car and help Shirley out, and together they all went up to the now velvety green of the incline, to the big door. "Oh, it is beautiful, beautiful," murmured Shirley in a daze of delight. She could not yet make it seem real that she was going to come to this charmed spot to live in a few days. Graham unlocked the big doors and sent them rolling back with a touch, showing what ball bearings and careful workmanship can do. The group stepped inside and stood to look again. The setting sun was casting a red glow through the diamond panes and all over the wide floor. The new partitions, guiltless of paint, for Graham had not dared to go further, were mellowed into ruby hangings. The stone fireplace rose at the opposite side of the room, and the new staircase was just at the side, all in the ruddy evening glow that carried rich dusky shadows into the corners and hung a curtain of vagueness over blemishes. Then, all suddenly, before they had had time to take in the changes, more than the fact of the partitions which they expected, Graham stepped to the side of the door and touched a button, and behold, a myriad of lights burst forth about the place, making it bright like noontime. "Oh, oh, oh!" breathed Carol in awe and wonder, and "oh!" again, as if there were nothing else to say. But Shirley only looked and caught her breath. It seemed a palace too fine for their poor little means, and a sudden fear gripped hold upon her. "Oh, Mr. Graham, you have done too much," she choked. "You shouldn't have done it. We can never afford to pay all this." "Not at all," said young Graham quickly. "This isn't anything. The electric people gave permission for this, and I thought it would be safer than lamps and candles, you know. It cost scarcely anything for the wiring. I had our regular man do it, that attends to the wiring and lights at the office. It was a mere trifle, and will make things a lot more convenient for you. You see, it's nothing to the company. They just gave permission for a wire to be run from the pole there. Of course, they might not do it for everyone, but I've some pretty good friends in the company, so it's all right." "But the fireplace," said Shirley, going over to look at it. "It's beautiful. It's like what you see in magazine pictures of beautiful houses." "Why, it's just the stones that were left from cutting the windows larger. I thought they might as well be utilized, you know. It wasn't much more work to pile them up that way while the men were here than if we'd had them carted away." Here Carol interrupted. "Shirley, there's a telephone! A real telephone!" Shirley's accusing eyes were upon her landlord. "It was put in for our convenience while the workmen were here," he explained defensively. "It's a payphone, you see, and it's of no expense except when it's in use. It can be taken out if you don't care to have it, of course, but it occurred to me that since it was here, your mother might feel more comfortable out here all day if she could call you when she needed to." Shirley's face was a picture of varying emotions as she listened, but relief and gratitude conquered as she turned to him. "I believe you've thought of everything," she said at last. "I've worried about that all this week. I've wondered if Mother would be afraid out in the country with only the children, and the neighbors not quite near enough to call. But this solves the difficulty. You're sure it hasn't cost you a lot to have this put in?" "Why, don't you know the telephone company is glad to have their phones wherever they can get them?" he evaded. "Now don't worry about anything more. You'll find hardships enough living in a barn, without fretting about the few conveniences we've been able to manage." "But this is real luxury," she said, sitting down on the steps and looking up where the lights blazed from the loft. "You've put lights up there, too, and a railing. I was so afraid Doris would fall down sometime." "I'm glad to find you're human after all, and have a few fears," declared the owner, laughing. "I'd begun to think you were Spartan through and through, and weren't afraid of anything. Yes, I had the men put what lumber they had left into that railing. I thought it wasn't safe to have it open like that, and I didn't want you to sue me for life or limb, you know. There's one thing I haven't managed yet, and that's piping water up from the spring. I haven't been able to get hold of the right man so far, but he's coming out tomorrow, and I hope it can be done. There's a spring on the hill back of us, and I believe it's high enough to get the water to this floor. If it is, it'll make your work much easier, and be only the matter of a few rods of pipe." "Oh, but indeed you mustn't do anything more," pleaded Shirley. "I shall feel so ashamed paying such a little rent." "But my dear young lady," said Graham, in his most dignified business manner, "you don't at all realize how much lower rents are in the country, isolated like this, than they are in the city. And you haven't as yet realized what a lot of inconveniences you will have to put up with. When you go back to the city in the winter, you'll be glad to get away from here." "Never," said Shirley fervently, and shuddered. "Oh, never. You don't know how dreadful it seems that we shall have to go back. But of course we shall. One couldn't live in a barn in the winter, even though it is a palace for the summer." And she looked about wistfully. Then, her eyes lighting up, she said in a low tone, for the young man's benefit alone, "I think God must have made you do all this for us." She turned and walked swiftly over to one of the new casement windows, looking out at the red glow that the sun in sinking had left in the sky. And there, against the fringes of the willows and the maples, shone out the bright weather vane on the spire of the little white church in the valley. "I think God must have sent you to teach me and my little sister a few things," said a low voice just behind Shirley, as she struggled with tired, happy tears that would blur her eyes. But when she turned to smile at the owner of the voice, he was walking over by the door and talking to Carol. They tumbled joyously into the car very soon, and sped on their way to the city again. That night, the Hollister children told their mother they had found a place in which to live. This is your host, Kathryn Lopez Luker. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Stories Come to Life. Be sure to join us next time when we continue to listen to the Enchanted Barn. Please let me know how you like this story, and make suggestions for others you'd like to hear. I'll talk to you again soon.